All right, so today we're really diving deep into the world of watercolor.
Okay.
And, specifically, we're going to be looking at this technique that I think is really key to creating those really stunning watercolor effects.
Mm-hmm.
And that is layering.
Yeah.
When I first started kind of messing around with watercolor, layering really did feel like a magic trick almost. Like you're building up these washes, they're so delicate, and then bam, suddenly you have this depth, you have this vibrancy, these textures that you wouldn't think that you could achieve with something that seems, at first glance so simple.
Right.
And what's I think even cooler about all this is that it's not even just about art, right? I mean, this whole concept of layering, of strategically kind of building upon an idea or a skill,
Yeah.
I mean, it applies to like pretty much everything,
It does, yeah.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves because today we are tackling this technique in the world of watercolor.
Well,
And we've got a great resource from you to kind of help us, to guide us through this.
Yeah.
And that is this fantastic blog post from Art News on Irish Artmart called Creating Depth in Watercolor. Tips for beginners on layering.
okay.
So get those paintbrushes ready, everybody. We're going to unlock these secrets. We're going to figure out how to layer like the pros do.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating about layering, I think, is that it really highlights what makes watercolor so unique. It's transparency.
Okay.
So unlike oils or acrylics, which are a lot bolder, watercolor, it allows light to pass through. And with layering, we can play with that in a really cool way.
Yeah.
So imagine you're painting a landscape.
Okay.
And you want those distant mountains to kind of fade into the background, almost like they've got a shroud of mist over them.
Yeah.
By layering these progressively lighter washes of blue, for instance, you're not just creating that illusion of distance, but you're mimicking, I think, how we actually perceive depth in the real world.
Yeah, that's what I love about this is that like you're playing with the light, you're playing with the color, but you're doing it in a way that it's, like you said, it mimics nature.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of color, our source points out that layering isn't just about depth. It's also about creating those really, really rich, luminous hues that watercolor is so famous for.
Absolutely. And, that's really important with watercolor because as watercolor artists know, that when you lay that color down, it tends to dry lighter than it appears when it's wet.
Exactly.
But with layering, what you're doing is you're essentially stacking those colors
Okay.
and allowing them to interact, to build upon each other. It's kind of like adding, I don't know, like a secret ingredient to your palette that adds this whole other level of complexity and vibrancy to the colors that you're using.
It's like those cocktails.
Yes.
Like those fancy layered cocktails where it's like each element is adding to this, this final masterpiece.
Exactly.
So far we've got depth, we've got these richer colors.
Wow.
What was that third benefit that our source mentioned?
Oh, yes. Texture.
Okay.
Think about trying to paint, I don't know, like a fluffy cloud or the bark on a tree. With layering, you can actually build up these subtle variations in color, in tone, that make those textures just pop. It's not just about what you paint, but how you layer those washes to create that sense of depth and realism.
Okay, you've sold me. I am officially hooked. So we know why layering is such a game changer, but let's get down to the how. How is it actually done? Our source outlines a few really kind of essential techniques here, and thankfully they sound way more approachable than I was originally expecting.
Right.
We're talking wet on dry. We're talking wet on wet. We're talking glazing. It's like watercolor has its own language.
It does, and like any language, once you understand those basic building blocks, you can experiment.
Right.
You find your own voice. So let's start with wet on dry.
Okay.
Which is, pretty self-explanatory.
Right.
You're applying wet paint to a dry surface.
Yeah, it makes sense.
This technique, it's all about control and precision.
Right.
Think of it like drawing with your watercolors.
Okay.
You can get those crisp lines,
Right.
sharp edges,
Yeah.
delicate details.
So like if I wanted to do like a delicate flower petal
Yeah.
with those
Exactly.
with the veins running through it,
Yes,
that's when I would use wet on dry.
exactly. Now, let's say you want to capture something, I don't know, a little dreamier,
Okay.
a little more ethereal,
Mhm.
like a misty morning.
Okay.
That's where wet on wet comes in.
Okay.
So this time, you're working with a wet surface,
Right.
either by pre-wetting your paper or applying the wet paint to a still damp wash.
So now that one, wet on wet, that one sounds a little more a little more my speed, I have to say. Yeah.
Because I love that idea of letting the colors kind of blend and bleed into each other.
Yeah.
And get these like soft, unpredictable effects.
Exactly. It's a really great way to kind of create atmosphere movement in your paintings. Think about, I don't know, soft focus backgrounds, luminous skies.
Right.
You know, even just these abstract washes of color where the water is doing, you know, some of the work for you.
Yeah, yeah.
But I will say,
yeah,
wet on wet, it requires a bit of practice.
I bet.
To really master water to pigment ratio.
Yeah.
And avoid those happy little accidents.
Yeah. So speaking of control,
okay,
our source mentions glazing.
Yes.
As a way to build up color kind of gradually, subtly. So what exactly is glazing?
And how is it different from, say, just doing another wet-on dry wash?
So think of glazing like applying a very thin veil of color over a dry layer.
Okay.
And you're not completely covering up what's underneath.
Right.
You're just enhancing it.
Okay.
Imagine, I don't know if you've ever seen those old hand-tinted photographs.
Yeah.
Where they would, you know,
add
that subtle wash of color, and it just brings a touch of life to that black and white image.
Yeah.
That's what glazing is.
So it's like those, like when you layer sheer fabrics.
Yes.
So each layer is adding depth and richness.
Yes.
Without totally obscuring what's underneath.
Exactly.
It sounds very
it's very subtle.
Subtle, yeah.
Sophisticated.
Yes.
And it creates this really luminous, almost glowing effect, especially as you layer those transparent washes, one over the other.
Yeah.
Now, we can't talk about layering without mentioning a couple of other techniques that are less about blending colors and more about manipulating the layers that are already there.
Okay.
Lifting and scumbling.
Okay, so lifting. I mean, that seems, you know,
it's
pretty self-explanatory.
Self-explanatory. You're removing paint to create highlights.
Right.
Or soften edges.
Yeah.
But scumbling.
Scumbling sounds.
It sounds a little more
adventurous.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's great for texture, for depth. So imagine you're dragging kind of a nearly dry brush loaded with paint across your paper. And you're allowing bits of that underneath layer to kind of peek through, so you're getting that sort of broken textured effect.
So it's like you're creating a texture on top of like the washes of color.
Yeah, exactly.
That are already there.
Yes.
To kind of add another dimension of realism.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Think about the texture of, I don't know, foliage or rough bark.
Yeah.
Or even like the weave of a fabric.
Right.
Scumbling can bring all of that to life in your watercolors.
Okay. Wow. My inner artist is so ready to go.
Yeah.
But before I go full Jackson Pollock on my watercolor pad.
Right.
Let's talk about some of the common pitfalls and how to avoid them.
Okay.
Our source had some great tips, and they start with using the right paper.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't bake a cake without the right ingredients, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Using the right watercolor paper is just as crucial. And it's not even just about preventing your paper from buckling under, you know, all those washes. It's about how the paint interacts with the surface.
Yeah, okay.
Our source specifically recommends using a heavier weight paper.
Okay.
Around 300 grinism.
Okay.
For optimal layering. It can handle those multiple washes without, you know, turning into a soggy mess.
Yeah.
And it allows for, you know, all those beautiful, subtle blends that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it makes sense to use the right paper. Okay, so, and speaking of things that can make or break your layering game, our source also stresses using transparent watercolors.
Oh, yes. Transparency. That's key. Yeah. Remember, we're working with light. We're letting those layers interact, shine through. You start using opaque colors. It's like trying to build, I don't know, a house of cards out of bricks. You're just not going to get that same luminous effect.
Right. You need that light to come through.
Exactly.
Okay, so look for transparent watercolors. Got it.
Yes, should say on the tube.
Perfect. Okay. Now, this last tip, this one hit home for me. This one I struggle with in all areas of life.
Okay.
Not even just art. And it is the importance of patience.
Oh, yeah. That's the hardest part, isn't it?
It is.
Resisting that urge to just rush the process.
Yeah.
Our source compares it to baking a cake. You know, you would pull a cake out of the oven before it's fully cooked, right?
Right.
It's the same with watercolor. Each layer needs that time to dry completely.
Okay.
Before you add the next one. Otherwise, you just risk muddying up your colors, losing that beautiful transparency.
It's about trusting the process,
Yes.
right? Like embracing that kind of slow and steady build, which honestly, I think that's a valuable lesson
It is.
in so many aspects of life, not just art.
Absolutely. And it actually brings me to a kind of a final thought-provoking point.
Okay.
You know, we've been exploring how layering transforms a watercolor painting, right?
Right.
But I think there's a really beautiful metaphor here.
Okay.
For life in general. Think about it. How often do we approach, I don't know, challenges or how we build our skills? How often do we use that layered approach?
Yeah.
We're building upon our experiences, right? We're adding these new layers of understanding, refining our techniques over time.
It's like you're building this rich and meaningful life,
Yeah,
like
okay.
one brushstroke at a time.
Exactly.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
the next time you're facing, a challenge and it just seems daunting, or you're working towards a goal that just feels so far away,
Right.
remember the power of layering.
Yeah.
Embrace the process.
Yeah.
Be patient. And trust that those layers, no matter how small they are, how subtle they seem, they are building something truly extraordinary.
I love that. What a fantastic way to wrap up our deep dive
Yeah.
into the art of layering. I mean, you've given us a lot to think about, not just with our art, but
Yeah.
also, like you said, just in how we approach, life in general.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, on another deep dive. We'll see you next time.